Elliot Kalan, welcome to Bullseye. I'm so happy to have you here on the show.
Thank you so much, Jesse. I'm so excited to be here on the show. One of my favorite shows.
Why did you want to reveal your secrets, Elliot?
Well, there comes a time when the skeletons in the closet just get too loud. The rattling of the bones. No, I so you mean my joke writing secrets?
Yeah.
I love joke writing and I love comedy. And comedy is not just jokes, but jokes are the most important part of comedy, in my opinion. I love when things are funny. And I felt like I've spent so much time writing jokes as a professional joke writer that I wanted to have a chance to kind of share what I've figured out, what I've learned, and also to help other people understand the work that goes into writing jokes, because I think on a very basic, selfish level, I think they'll appreciate it more if they know it's really hard to do, but it's really interesting, and it's not just somebody getting up on stage and picking up the microphone and just spitting their truth off the dome and just making people guffaw with reality. There's a lot of work that goes into writing jokes, and I know personally the more I learn about the way something works, the more I'm interested in it, the more I appreciate it. I'm hoping that's what happens here, but also because there's a lot of joke writers out there, Jesse, that are relying on their gut instinct. They're just writing based on inspiration alone, and that's no way to build a joke writing career. You'll wear yourself out. You'll burn out from it. And so I wanted to show people there's a way to write jokes where you can do it reliably, you can do it on demand, and in a funny way that lowers the amount of anxiety and stress that you will carry if you are just a servant to inspiration and have to wait for your brain to tell you it has a joke ready for you when it decides.
Why is this book called Joke Farming and not called Joke Grabbing or Joke Hunting or Joke Catching?
That's a very good question, and I'll tell you exactly why. So I think a lot of people, when they start writing jokes, they are joke grabbers or joke hunters. I call it joke foragers, that people who are kind of pulling funny ideas out of the air as they come to them, the same way that early humans, were dependent on the herds of wild beasts roaming through the savannah, where they were, and had no control over when food would be available. When you're starting out joke writing, you don't have control over when jokes come to you, And joke farming to me is figuring out a way, and so I have this joke writing process that I use, and I just advise people, I say, in the book, I say, this is how I do it. You don't have to do it this way, but you should think about how your brain thinks and develop a process that feels right to you, but a way to be able to write jokes kind of reliably, to be able to write them on demand, write them when you need to, rather than being subject to the unpredictability and unreliability of sudden inspiration, or gut writing and hoping that an idea comes to you. And it's exactly that difference between being a joke hunter, where you got to go out and find those ideas that hopefully exist, and a joke farmer, where you're like, I can create my own jokes. I know how to sow the seeds and then reap the rewards.
Something that drove home for me the idea of joke farming relative to joke gathering in your book was, I think a lot of folks understand that comics have notebooks.
Yes.
Right?
They love to bring them up on stage and then flip them and go, what else? What else?
Yeah.
What else?
But, everybody knows Larry David has a notebook and he writes things down in it, and then he, if he loses it, it's a catastrophe or whatever, right?
Yeah. I remember the nationwide search for that one notebook. Yeah.
But I think people who don't write comedy might imagine that what someone is writing in that notebook is jokes.
Mm-hmm.
And it may be that occasionally they are writing down a joke they thought of. Maybe they were talking to someone and said something funny and thought, oh, I should remember that. That was good. But more often, as you describe in the book, what they might be writing down is the seeds for growing jokes later.
Yeah.
Things they have noticed, things they have noticed they care about, things that they have noticed they have a perspective on.
Yeah. You're writing down often because I also carry, I'll show you. I have my own notebook. This one's pretty beat up. I'm due for a new one.
Yeah, you definitely bought that at the 99-cent store.
I bought
a packet of 4.
I bought a case of 72
from
the Dollar Tree website.
Excellent.
Because I realized I liked this brand a lot. But I have stuff in here that it's like, for instance, my podcast, The Flophouse, we just did a show in Chicago, and I had to do a presentation about Chicago. And so I have some joke ideas in here for things I can say about Chicago, and it's like, right here it just says, can't roast Chicago harder than Mrs. O'Leary's cow. Like that's just, so it's like not a full joke, but it's
Right.
like part of the way to a joke. And so you're writing down just kind of like, thoughts or things or something that doesn't make sense. A lot of jokes come from a thing that just kind of confuses or irritates you. And so you might write down something like, how clean are the shoes at the shoe store? Like, you don't know, but that's not a joke. It's just a thing that might be kind of like confusing or annoying, and later you can process it,
Let's get simple. What are the constituent parts of a joke?
So, okay, there's two ways to think about this.
Okay.
Way number one is just the physical structure of a joke, which is just the simplest way to do it is there's a setup and there's a punchline. There's a piece of information, and then there's the last piece of information that changes your understanding of that first piece of information in some way. To get it into beyond just structure, these are the basic elements of a joke. Okay, there's voice. Who is telling the joke? Where's it coming from? Every joke implies a teller, a mind that is creating this, and it's expressing their point of view or their perspective or their frame of reference. There's the premise of the joke. What is the thing they're trying to say? What's the intention of this joke? And what's the funny kind of little story that you tell to get that intention across? There's the structure I just talked about. How do you arrange the elements of information in this joke? A joke is basically time release units of information that are meant to plant ideas or feelings in the audience's mind in the right order, and then leaving out just enough of that information so that the audience has to fill in a little bit of it. And that's where you're literally getting the joke. You're really literally understanding what's not being said in it and filling it in so you get it as a joke.
As though the joke teller is holding two live wires and bringing them closer to each other until they're close enough that the audience is that electrical arc between them.
That's such a better metaphor than the one I use in the book. but exactly that. You want to pull the wires close enough together that the electricity jumps between them, but you're not just jamming them together. Then there's tone. What is the feeling of this joke? I define tone as the kind of emotional temperature that tells the audience how sincere or ironic you're being. Is what you're saying meant to be taken as, this is how I feel about it? Or is what you're saying meant to be taken as, this is just a funny idea? Are you, is this Nanette or are you Stephen Wright? Like, is this incredibly, like, emotionally sincere, or are you a man from another planet who is telling you things that could never be true? Then there's what I call wording, which is just precision. It's just, going to each detail of a joke and making sure it is clear enough, specific enough.
And the wording doesn't have to be words in your telling. It could be visual elements. It could be, but that sort of specificity and clarity.
Yes, you could also call it detailing, but wording was just the easiest way to put it. But it also means just fine-tuning the elements. And then finally the audience. And that's probably the most important element of a joke, is the audience, is having someone to react to it, because a joke lives, for the audience, it lives in the moment when they understand it. And for me, at least, as a joke maker, it lives in the moment where I have released the joke into the open, and I have that thousandth of a second maybe where I'm waiting to see if the audience likes it or not. And that's the most exciting part of the whole process.
So the techniques that you describe in this book are ones that you learned writing for 10 or 12 years on the most like expository, argumentative, point of view driven television show in the history of television comedy. The Daily Show. Certainly.
It's in the top 5 argumentative expository comedy shows. Yeah.
I mean, it's like a show that created a genre of television, which is a sort of like essay about what's going on in the world that is comedy.
I mean, that's one of the amazing things about Jon Stewart's achievement with that show, is taking a format of like, we're going to tell jokes about the news, and creating in it his preferred way to deliver his thoughts in a funny way. And it was such a powerful way to do it that, like you're saying, there's this whole genre of shows that are like that. But it very much, I think, was him spending years figuring out what fits my voice and my sensibility in the way that I want to deliver this work.
One of the things that you write in the book that awed me, even as a man that knows you as a careful, fastidious thinker.
Some would say too much. Some would say loosen up, Elliot.
Was that at The Daily Show, where you eventually became head writer, you would write down non-comic turns of phrase that you heard Jon Stewart use.
Yeah.
so that you could put them into scripts later so they would sound more like something he would say.
Yes, that's something I picked up from a book about White House speechwriters that I read, not for work, just because I wanted to read it. And which is the thing I'd say to a lot of people who want to be writers or joke writers, just read and watch a lot of the stuff you like. Don't just do everything for work, because the stuff you do for your own enjoyment is going to come into play and work much more than you think it is. But I knew that my job was to write for his voice particularly, and the correspondence voices, but mostly for his voice. And so whatever I could do to really internalize that voice and get it down and understand it, and it helped taking phrases that I would hear him say a lot, be like, okay, cool, if I put that in, he's going to recognize that on the page as something he says, or he'll know how to say it, and it'll just put that much more of his reality and his stamp on it. And I felt like my job often at that show was, I'm going to write the jokes that Jon would have written if he either had the time I have now or knew this one piece of information that I know that I don't know whether he knows or not. But it is conceivable that he would know it. So it was my job to slightly expand his voice or frame of reference with what individual things I could bring to it, but to very much live in his voice and his frame of reference. So certain things that he said, I would just be like, oh yeah, I've heard him say that 5 times in meetings.
What's a phrase that Jon Stewart said 5 times in meetings?
It's been so long now. Can I remember them? Let's see. I mean, for instance, he would always refer to Stephen Colbert as like this young man, or like a young man I know named Stephen Colbert, things like that. So I'd be like, okay, if he's going to, so I wrote a draft once of something where he was talking about, I don't know if it was Stephen leaving to go to the CBS show or something else, but I was like, all right, well, this rough version of it, because I know John's I'm going to have him refer to him as this young man, or something like that. Or some of it was just kind of like New Jersey types of things, calling people guys, these guys, or can you believe those guys, that kind of stuff.
What's an example of a news story that came down the pike when you were working on The Daily Show, and how did you break it into a desk monologue for Jon Stewart?
Unfortunately, the one that comes to mind most readily is one of the sadder stories, unfortunately. The one that sticks out in my mind the most, I think because it was the most challenging for us, was when the Charlie Hebdo massacre took place in France. And it was really brutal. It was really, the next day after that, when we were going to have to write that show, it was a very tough day and a tough start to the day, because it felt like we have to cover it. Like, we're a comedy show. Involves a comedy thing, and it's a rough story, and we didn't really know exactly what to say about it. And the great thing about it was that we had our process. We had our process of, we meet and you talk about how we feel about it. We try to come up with ways to express that in comedy. We try to develop it further throughout the day. We look for other stories that we can use to buttress the argument we're making or the point we're making. And because we had this production process, we were able to let the process kind of lead us through the day. And so it was a matter of like, okay, what do we really think about this? How do we feel about it? And Jon would say often, he would tell us to steer into the skid, that if like we were uncomfortable about something in a story, that's where you would want to explore the most. Not to just say something uncomfortable or say something, that will make other people uncomfortable. But if that's the part of the story that is bothering us, then that's the thing that means the most to us. And I don't remember who it was, but somebody found a story about these cows in Europe that were descended from cows the Nazis had bred to be like super cows, and they were still finding their genes in modern cattle in Europe. And it became this thing about how hard it is to stamp out extremism, like it's still there decades later, even in the cows. And it was one of these things where it was, okay, let's talk about how this makes us feel. Let's look for other stories that could help us to illustrate this and help us find a comedic premise. So we're not just stating outright, this is terrible and we feel bad about it. And I felt the show that came out was super successful as a result of it.
I went to a couple of Daily Show tapings, which were a great time. But the thing that struck me when I was sitting in that room, it would strike me occasionally on TV, but especially sitting in that room, is
how cold the room was.
No.
Oh.
Jon Stewart was a godhead to that audience.
Mm-hmm.
They couldn't have adored Jon Stewart more if he was George Washington sitting before them, right? And it complicated the act of doing comedy, because no matter what Jon Stewart said, people would whoop and applaud as though he had just cured polio. Was it ever difficult to write for a guy who was so adored as to be like, it's hard to discern what's actually working for the audience?
No, I don't. It wasn't difficult to write for him. It was difficult sometimes when you were watching the show because you'd be like, listen to what he's really saying. And Jon, who I have nothing but great things to say about, working for him was truly a wonderful experience for me, and I learned so much, and I really grew up at that show. I started there when I was 20, and I was a college intern, and when I left, I was 32, 33, and I had a family, and I was the head writer, and I feel like there's a number of people there that I owe an enormous amount to, and learning from Jon was really amazing, and I think it helped that we're both kind of like Jersey Jewish guys, so I understood his language, but it was really fantastic. So I'm not going to say anything bad about him if you're trying to get me to say something bad about him.
Not at all.
I think for the audience, it wasn't hard to write, but I bet it was probably frustrating in the performance sometimes. And I don't know if Jon felt this way, but I know I sometimes took satisfaction when he would say something that the audience did not like. When Obama was a relatively new president and Jon would criticize him and the audience would have a knee-jerk like, wait, what? But I like him. That was always a little satisfying. Or if we told a joke where the audience went, ooh, like it was a little too much for them, that was always a little satisfying.
Did you ever worry whether you were writing a laugh line or an applause line?
No, I didn't. Not me personally, because I just wasn't trying to. And I think it's funny because in the book I talk about how the audience they are literally the other half of what creates a joke. Like if there's not someone to laugh at a joke, to hear it and laugh or not to laugh at it, then it doesn't really exist as a joke. You need an audience. And so it's funny to think that in some ways I was discounting their reaction. I was hoping they would react to it the way I would prefer, which was with laughter rather than applause. But at the same time also, sometimes applause means they really like the joke. Like the best was laughter followed by applause, as opposed to applause with no laughter, meaning we agree with you, but we weren't really listening to the joke part of it. But laughter followed by applause means that was a great joke. My laughter is not stating how great I thought it was. I got to slap my hands together. But I think it was something that, at least from my point of view, I was so focused on Jon as the audience for my jokes because he was the decider of what jokes would end up on the show. And my goal was, I got to get jokes on the show. Any episode that I'm writing for, because, you weren't always on each day's show, but any episode I'm writing for, my goal is to get at least one joke on the show. And if I can get a joke that I wrote in the morning on the show, that's the best thing of all. If it's a joke I wrote in the afternoon, that's still great, but it's not as good. And
that's because in the afternoon it might have been an emergency, or at the very least it's a third draft.
Yes, exactly. It's a later thing. Whereas if you wrote it in the morning, it's like it got through all the hurdles. Like every obstacle that was thrown in its path, it still ended up on the show. That's an achievement.
It's interesting that like the role of the host of a program, this is true in news as well. I've never worked in news, so this is something I only learned as an adult wandering through the halls of NPR in Washington, D.C. or whatever. And you learn that the role of the host on the show is to host the show. But ultimately the role of the host of the show, the most important perhaps role of the host of the show is to be where the buck stops, to be the person who decides what the tone and content of the program is. Ultimately, there's a fire hose of stuff from writers and reporters or whatever it is. And somebody says, this is what's important. This doesn't work. We would say this way, and so on down the line. And ultimately, that's the person whose mouth is opening and closing into the microphone. Yeah.
He has the ultimate say and should have the ultimate say because he is the one who is standing up for that joke and who is going to be attached to it, or for a news show, that news has to stand behind that news story. And you can't just say, oh, well, they put it in there and I didn't know what it was and I just read it. Then it's, who are you? You're just a face. You're just a voice. You're not a thinking person creating direction at that point. And writers would often get frustrated if Jon felt a joke was going too far, and he would never be like, this will never happen. It just wouldn't get chosen, or it would get rewritten after rehearsal or something. And sometimes writers would be like, ugh, he doesn't want to say it, and I'd be like, yeah, because it's easy for us to write a joke and then just kind of give it to him and say it. If he says something that he doesn't fully believe or can't fully stand behind, it's still attached to him. People still assume that's what he's thinking or saying, and he can't say, oh, well, the writer wrote that. It's on them. That can't happen. And so it's very easy for the person who's not public-facing to not feel that responsibility the way that the host has to feel.
You lately have been working on an upcoming Ghostbusters television show.
Yes.
A Fox TV show about talking animals.
Well, that was a while ago. Yeah.
You know, these are not topical.
They're not news joke shows. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is real nice in today's world. It's real nice not to have to make the world funny. Yeah.
So here's my question for you. The world of news jokes is upside down right now.
Yeah.
Like it has been at no time in my life. Stephen Colbert got canceled.
Mm-hmm. And like legitimately business canceled, not socially said the wrong thing canceled.
Yes.
Like the show will end.
You know, Jimmy Kimmel was pulled from the air after a direct threat from the chairman of the FCC to pull the broadcast license of his network because the FCC and the president didn't like his show.
Yeah.
How does it feel right now to have this long history of writing jokes about the news when writing those jokes about the news is the most fraught thing you could possibly be writing jokes about now, even in the context of an entertainment economy that's upside down in general?
Yeah. If I was in that world right now, I think I'd be really worried and I think I'd be really anxious. But at the same time, I think there'd be a kind of thrill to it. And I think from where I'm sitting now, I have a kind of an envy and a kind of FOMO because it's much more fraught. But that also is the flip side of that is that it means a lot more right now. Like now's a time when it's really meaningful to make those jokes in a way that it wasn't necessarily as meaningful during some of the times I was at The Daily Show. It was important, I think, in some ways, but it was not dangerous in the way it kind of is now in a real way. I talk about satire in the book a little bit, and I talk about how satire is really hard to pull off, and it can get you in real trouble if it doesn't work right, or if it does work right, and that in other countries, often when a totalitarian government takes over, it is comedians and satirists that are thrown in jail right away because dictators have very thin skins, and it's a lot harder to frighten someone when they see the ridiculousness in you. I think one of the most amazing things recently was the decision by the protesters in Portland, I think it was, to like dress silly when they were protesting ICE, because it instantly makes it harder, I think, it makes it harder for anyone to buy into the kind of narrative that the government is pushing. This place is chaos. It's shambles. We have to send these soldiers in. We have to send the National Guard in, because if it was chaos and shambles, like would people be dressed as like silly frogs and unicorns, things like that? Probably not. But also because it instantly reflects back on their opponents a sort of ridiculousness. But there's a quote in the book that I have from Alan Moore, the comic book author and wizard, or warlock, I should say, warlock, because he talks about casting magic spells on people. Because if you cast a spell on somebody, put a curse on them, maybe they'll be cross-eyed, maybe their chickens will lay eggs funny for a little bit. But if you cast a satire on somebody, they will lose their respect in the eyes of their colleagues, of their fellow citizens, of maybe their family, of maybe themselves. And if you write the satire well enough, hundreds of years later, people will still be laughing derisively at this person, and that there's a real power to that, and that this is why, historically, you have crackdowns on these types of things when someone is in power who is both power hungry and has low self-esteem. And so I'm very worried for my colleagues in that part of the business, more because it's hard to live your life when you don't know if the government is going to destroy the thing you're working at. You know, if you're going to lose your job or your health insurance or anything like that, it's very tough. But there is a sort of an envy in some ways that like, oh yeah, they're like in the middle of it right now, and there's probably something very meaningful about that. There's something, as difficult as it is, and as probably frustrating as the work is, there's something very like ennobling about feeling like, oh yeah, well I'm doing this at a time when it matters, you know. That being said, I feel like that's the kind of comedy that lives in the moment and then kind of evaporates after a little bit, whereas the comedy that lasts for a very long time is often the stuff that is sillier or more general. And so my goal, kind of selfishly, has been to try to work lately in comedy that could last 1,000 years, less because it is so profound than because it's so kind of like goofy, you know, or so silly that you're just reliably going to laugh at it. And I find that the comedy that I hold to myself most dearly is not necessarily the comedy that like makes a strong point, but the comedy that makes me laugh.
Well, Elliot Kalan, thank you so much for all your time, and thanks for your wonderful book.
Thank you so much for having me, Jesse. It has been such a pleasure to talk to you, and I will love this moment always.